Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome to my first video in my new series, One Stamp 4 Ways, where I'm using the Penny Black Burst of Blooms stamp. Here is the first card I will be making. I just used 2 Zig watercolor markers. Here is the stamp. It's just such a pretty flower stamp that you can do so much with, so I'm excited about the next set of cards. And Penny Black always has an image on the back that shows you an example of coloring, and I love that they do that. So let's get started. I'm going to be taking the foam insert out of my MISTI. I'm using a piece of Bristol cardstock because it works really well with the Zig markers. I'm going to position my stamp in the lower left-hand corner, and then I'm going to ink it up with some Versamark ink and stamp it down. I'm going to sprinkle it with some white embossing powder so that it is resisted. And then I will heat it to set it. And I always heat the back of the paper as well, and that helps to kind of uncurl the paper a little bit. I purchased this set of Ranger artist brushes a while back, and I really have got a lot of use out of them. They're really nice quality brushes. I'm going to pull the smallest one out, and I've got my Zig marker here in black, and then I have a jar of water. So I like to kind of create a methodology for doing flowers just to make it easy and manageable. So what I'm going to do is the same process on each one of these petals, and that is to take my marker and draw a little bit of color just at the base of each one of these petals, and you can see that I'm really not adding too much. And now I'm going to take my brush, and the way I'm going to do this here is I'm going to start on the outside, and then I'm going to move toward the color. And once I get to the color, my paper is all going to be wet inside the entire petal, and so my color has somewhere to go, and so it'll spread to the edge of the petal, and but it'll still keep it pretty dark at the base. See, now I noticed I had a little bit too much water, so I'm just going to take my brush, and this is mostly a dry brush. So you can see I'm going to wipe it off on my tissue that I always keep handy, and it'll soak up any extra water. So that's a good technique to try if you accidentally drop too much water into a petal. Okay, so I'm going to do that same thing again. I'm going to kind of go in tiny circles toward the center and then pull the color out. And then you can always wipe your brush on the tissue if you have too much color. Now I'm actually pulling this color all the way to the edge, and I want it to be not black, but kind of a light gray by the time I get to the edge. So I experimented a little bit with each one of these petals to kind of figure out my method here. And this one has a little less water, so you can see the black doesn't immediately rush to the edge of the petal because I have less water on my brush. I don't know if you noticed I wiped it on the tissue before I first hit the cardstock. And then I added some water, so it's really flexible. You can always add more water if you need to. The Bristol paper is really good at spreading this color around, so it doesn't kind of hold into the cardstock very quickly. So here again, I've got a little bit too much water on that petal, so I'm going to wipe my brush on the tissue and really dry it, and then just lay it in the petal, and the brush will soak up the water. And I've heard this called a thirsty brush, so it's more of a dry brush to absorb some of the water. For this first flower, I'm working in sections just so I can show it to you, but for the next flowers, I'm just going to do each step for the entire flower. All right, so I just wanted to show you a couple more petals here. So you can see that I, start the water and move toward the base. And also notice that I make sure that I go all the way to the base, but I don't pull all of the black out. You don't want too much water at the base of the petal because you want it to be really super black. And so you can always go back and add a second layer if you find that you're not having enough black at the base, and I'm actually going to do that on one of these petals in just a bit here. I also want to mention that this black marker is sold individually, and I have used it multiple times just by itself. It's such a great marker, and you're going to see one of the steps here. I'm actually just coloring with the marker as just a black marker. It's got a very, very fine tip, so it's really easy to color with, and it gives you a solid black image when you color with it, even if you don't want to use the water. Okay, so now that I've finished that flower, I'm going to move on to the next one. So I'm going to do this same step here where I color in the base and then pull the color out with the brush and the water. I'm going to do that on all of these flowers before I move on to the next step. There are 2 types of petals on these flowers. There's the ones that we've been doing so far, which are the inside view of the petals. There are some that are from the outside view, so I just wanted to show you a few of those. I'm basically using the same exact technique I used on the other ones, which is to just put a little bit of black at the bottom and then I'll take my water, I'll start in the white area, and I'll pull out the color. And these tend to be a little bit smaller than the inside view of the petals, so you want to try not to pull too much black out toward the top. So I have 2 more of these petals on this flower, so I'm just fast forwarding it a little bit. You can see on this third one here, I did quite a long line of black, and it turns out that was a lot. So a little bit goes a very long way with this black marker. So you can always wipe off the color on your tissue. I am going to do one small additional step on these outside petals, and that is to take some black from the craft mat so it's not quite so strong, and just kind of color over a second layer. So I waited until these were dry. So this is my second layer just above that white dotted line, just to give it a little bit of variation as it gets toward the tip of the petal. So that is my process for the flowers. I'm just going to go ahead and fast forward this a little bit. And show you this next one very quickly. It's kind of fun to see how it comes together in fast motion. And then I did want to show you that there was one area where there wasn't enough black, right here on this large petal. And remember I said you could always go back in and add another layer. So I wanted to show you how I did that. And you can see I'm using the same technique where I start kind of away from the black and go toward the black. But notice that I'm covering the entire petal with water, not just the area that I want to add black to. And the reason why I'm doing that is if I stop in the middle of the petal, I'll get a water stain. So if you go back and add another layer, just make sure that you cover the whole entire area, like out to the outside edge of the embossed area with water. All right, I'm just going super fast to finish this step on all of the flowers. I did notice that this color had a purple tint to it, the Zig color. When I first did a version of this flower, I used black soot, and it was much more grayish looking, where this is much more purple. So I thought that was interesting, but you could use black soot. That's another good marker to use for this technique. Okay, so moving on to the stems, I'm going to make them black as well. So I'm going to do basically the same thing I did on the flower, and that is to add a little bit of black in the shadow area, so where it's going to be darkest. So at the bottom of the stem, and then kind of where the 2 stems meet in the middle. And you can see I had a little bit too much black, so I wiped the water off my brush, went in with a drier brush, and picked up some of the water, which also picked up some of the color. So that's how you can get sort of a lighter area. So just add more water or just a dry brush. There are also some like little bud flowers, and I'm going to color these again the same way. There's a dotted white line on one side of the buds, and that is where I'm going to drop my color. And then I'll just take my brush. I'm still using that very small number 2 brush, and just kind of drop some water in and spread it around. And these areas are pretty small, so it's really pretty quick and doesn't take too much time to get the whole thing covered with the black. So just fast forwarding this quickly to finish these last set of buds. So I'm doing everything on these flowers with just the black Zig marker. I have a little too much black there, so I picked it up. Okay, so that finishes kind of my first step for the flowers. The next thing I'm going to do is work on the background. I just wanted to accent the flowers a little bit with some color in the background. This is a light blue marker, and you can see I'm doing direct to paper just in the small areas between the flowers, because that's where you're going to get the darkest shadow, is where it's right underneath the flowers or between them. So that's where I want my darkest blue to be. Okay, once I get that color laid down, I'm going to take the same number 2 brush, and I'm using the same technique. So I'm starting in the white, I'm moving toward the blue, and then I'm pulling the blue out until I hit all white. So you want to keep brushing outward until you feel like you don't have any more blue left on your brush. And the reason why you want to do that is because you don't want to have any kind of blue lines kind of ending where your water is. So you can see I'm pulling the blue out. I'm just going to kind of keep going out until I have no blue left on my brush. And you want to be careful not to touch any of the black so that the black gets on the blue area. So you can see I'm fast forwarding this. I'm just kind of pulling this color out. And this is just the first part. This is where I'm going to have the darkest blue area. Now I'm ready to extend my blue out a little bit more. I'm going to use the next brush up, which is number 6. And I'm going to take my same light blue marker and I'm going to put some on my craft mat because I don't want this to be too dark. And what I love about the Zig markers is that they have light colors. So most of the watercolor sets, you make the colors lighter by diluting them. And so the problem with that is if you don't have enough water, then you're going to get a darker color and you get a lot more variation when you lay it down on your paper. But you can see because this is a very light blue, it starts light blue and it basically goes to no color. And I'm using the larger brush because I'm trying to cover a larger area, and also the larger brush is going to be able to hold more water so that I can pull it out and have a nice easy transition from blue to basically nothing. So I'm going to keep going here and I'm going to go all the way around the flowers here, and I'm going to pull it out until the same technique I did before where I pull the color out until I basically don't have any color on my brush or until I hit the edge of the paper. Because this color is so light and I'm using a lot of water, I'm going to have to kind of reload my craft mat pretty often. But I'm going to start at the edge of my flowers and move outward just enough to get the color all the way behind the flowers, but not to the edge of the cardstock. So I'm really not covering the whole entire thing with the blue, just enough to kind of fade it out to white. So I had 2 steps for the background and now I have 2 steps for the flowers. We've already done the first step. The second step is really simple. I'm going to color the edges of these petals. There's a little kind of segment at the very tip, and I'm going to color them directly with the same black marker I used for the watercolor. It has a very, very fine tip, so it's really easy to stay within the lines, but of course it helps that the image is white embossed, so I have those kind of embossing walls that I can contain my color in. I only have this edge on the petals that are inside facing. So you can see I'm going to color these, and where I did that kind of dark line at the top with the outside petals, I'm not going to color those at all. So I'm totally done with those already. All right, now you can see why it's better to do the background before this step, because in the first version of this card, I did the background after this step, and it was really, really hard to prevent my blue brush with the light blue from hitting that black edge, and so it would immediately bleed into the background. So that's why it's important to do your background first. I'm also coloring these little circles, and at the very center, there's only one center. This is the only flower that has a center, and so I'm coloring that one also as well. And I think the edges and those little dots in the middle really make these flowers stand out when you make them completely solid black. All right, so I just did that around the whole thing, and I just fast forwarded that to the end here so you wouldn't have to see. But you notice I have a smudge here, and I was like, I don't know how that happened. But of course I had some ink on my hands and I touched it, so I got my sanding block out, and I'm just going to carefully, with a very light hand, sand down that area. And you can see I did a pretty good job. It came off pretty well. You could still see it a little bit, but it wasn't that big of a deal, and I was happy with it. But little did I know that there would be much bigger problems later, and we'll get to that. All right, so I'm going to do my sentiment. It's from the Altenew UR set. I love this set. It has the greatest set of sentiments in it, and I use it all the time. I'm just going to heat emboss with white on some black cardstock. This is my Stampin' Up! Black cardstock. And I'm just going to trim off a little bit, 1/8 of an inch on 2 sides, so I have a 1/16 of an inch mat. Now here's a good tip for you if your paper is warped. The Scotch foam tape really helps to unwarp the paper, kind of reshapes it. But what you have to do is you have to kind of lay your hand down to flatten out the paper completely. So get it to the shape you want. So you can see I'm going to push my paper down with my left hand, flatten it all out, and then put my foam tape on. And so the foam tape is going to keep the paper in the position that it's in right now when I put the tape on. I had a little bit of a longer piece here, so I had to rip it off. But I did that same technique on all sides. So you see I'm holding it down and then putting my tape, and it really made a huge difference in making this a completely flat piece of paper. I just can't believe I didn't think of doing this before. Anyway, here is where I figured out where that black smudge came from. So I just got black smudges all over the entire panel. And I realized it's because the embossed areas that resisted my black marker were still wet because the color was laying on the embossed area. So when I tapped it and tapped it to get it to stick, I tapped the black marker all over my panel. Anyway, so the first thing I did was wipe off any excess black that was on the flowers with a tissue, and now I'm getting to work with my sanding block. The nice thing is that the Bristol paper is really thick, so I'm not going to really sand through it very quickly. And it's watercolor paper, so it's a little bit loose in its layers, and so it's easier to get those smudges off. It's not perfect, but it looks pretty good. I actually fast forwarded 3 minutes of sanding into 15 seconds there. Anyway, so I have my sentiment that I'm going to adhere with some two-way glue, and then I'm just going to trim off the excess here. And that will complete my card for today. I love the way these black flowers look. They just really are striking. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that and those little tips and my little mess up there. And I will see you next time for the next card in this series. Thanks for watching.